Well, if you're like me, you would want to get a room full of scientists in around this thing to see what other information we can find. And fortunately, there are some people out there who are just that crazy. In 1978, the Shroud underwent a huge battery of tests from the scientific community. In fact, the Shroud is, to this day, the most scientifically tested relic in the history of the world. All right? They did x-rays. They did chemical analysis. They did other kinds of electromagnetic spectroscopy. They analyzed the pollen. They analyzed soil samples from the Shroud. There were textiles people who examined the weaving pattern in the cloth. A whole bunch of other tests that we won't go into at this moment to just see what we could learn about this relic. Now, interestingly enough, we tested the material for blood, and the test confirmed real human blood, and it's the type AB. We can tell what blood type it is. We can't get DNA from the samples. They're too corrupted, but we can tell the blood type. Now here's something interesting. There are other invisible fluids that would be present in a crucified man. And we know that this shroud dates back at least to the Middle Ages, right? Skeptics would say only to the Middle Ages and that it was forged and made up, right? Other people will say that this is truly Jesus. It goes back to the 1st century, right? But regardless of whether you believe that it's authentically ancient or from the Middle Ages, this is from a body of a crucified man. The science that we have now tells us the chemicals that would be on this cloth, because the body would build up certain chemicals due to the stress of a crucifixion. And it's different from other kinds of death. All right? Those are the fluids we find on this shroud. Now, if you're living in the Middle Ages and you want to make a forgery of the shroud, you might be smart enough to take human blood and use it as your paint, right? But if this image was painted on, how would a medieval forger know about all the other chemicals that he would need to place in the appropriate anatomical places where those chemicals would be if the man was crucified? There's no way that a medieval forger could have appropriately known what chemicals to put there. Furthermore, studying the shroud revealed that the image on the shroud wasn't painted on. There's no dye, there's no chemicals that would be used in pigments for paint. It's all organic material and something else, which I'll get to in a moment. So what we can say about this is it was caused by a real body that underwent a crucifixion. Now, a medieval forger could have been very sadistic and decided, I'm going to kill somebody to try and make it look like I have the shroud of the Lord, right? And they crucify him in the exact manner that Jesus was crucified. They wrap him in a shroud, and that's why it's a forgery. Okay. Let's see if we can give evidence for or against that hypothesis. But the one thing we can definitely say for now, to start, is that this is not an artwork, and this is not painted on. This is from a real dead body that was crucified. Take a second to just look at the image here close up. I wanted to give you a slightly closer view of the image. On the right, again, that's the original shroud, and on the left is the sort of ghostly negative image version. And again, those triangles are the burn marks where the shroud was damaged by fire. Now, when we look at this image, we know there's blood there, but the entire image is not blood. In fact, only some select parts of the image are blood. You can see there's blood here on the wounds where from the nail marks. There's blood here where the thorns were placed in the crown. There's some blood from the scourge marks, but there's all this other image that isn't strictly from blood. And the way that we know that is, first of all, the image is just on the extreme surface level of the fiber. It doesn't penetrate into the linen. Blood or any sort of pigment or any sort of other chemical would seep into the cloth. And whatever this image is composed of, it doesn't do that. Furthermore, we can see that the blood was on the cloth before the image got on the cloth. So somehow the cloth is absorbing a little bit of blood, but then after that, somehow the image goes onto the cloth because we can see that it's superimposed over the blood. That's weird. Let's learn more. So we've tried to figure out if this was medieval forgery, how could they have done it? So we've done lots of different experiments and tests to try and reproduce the image. We tried to do it using using chemicals available in the Middle Ages. If someone was a genius, like Leonardo da Vinci type genius, right? And they were able to figure out that sunlight can cause photographic images, and they painted the shroud with certain chemicals. Could they produce an image like this? And people have actually tried to do this, to try and replicate it using our modern knowledge, and we can't do it. Plus, the shroud doesn't show any of those chemicals. So it wasn't done through like an ancient photography method. People have tried taking a statue made out of metal in the shape of a person, right? And wrapping it in the shroud, heating up the metal so that it would like cause a burn on the shroud. That burn method is not consistent. The burn actually penetrates into the fibers in a deeper way, and the image that comes out doesn't have that subtlety of, you can almost see it's shaded. And the parts that are closest to the cloth are darker, and the parts that are further away are lighter. That doesn't happen when if you put blood on your face, right? And you used a towel to wipe it off, you would have a very flat image. There wouldn't be that shading, right? It would just be like a handprint, a handprint on a piece of paper. It's just where the skin touches, there's marks, and where the skin doesn't touch, it's white. That's it. That's not what this image is like. So we have not been able to figure out a way to reproduce this image. Furthermore, there's no other image like it. The image is, as I mentioned, we use the word refined, talk about this subtle shading. It had to have been produced actually by light. Only light could produce this. So somehow light was generated by the body. And because of the kind of image that's on this cloth, we can tell that it's actually caused by the fibers becoming slightly dehydrated. So it's as if the body, for a moment, glowed and caused this image to imprint onto the cloth. And in order for that to happen, science tells us that the light would have to be extremely intense and extremely quick. Because if it was any less intense, it wouldn't have left a mark at all. And if it was not quick enough, then it would have burned the entire cloth, would have just vaporized. So it has to be this perfect balance of what we call the only thing that we know of that can do anything like this would have to be a type of vacuum ultraviolet radiation, ultraviolet light, emanating from the body for 1/40 billionth of a second. And it would have to be several billion watts of power. And you could look to Robert Spitzer or John Jackson's study online if you want the evidence that backs that up. So, by the way, we do not currently have the technology or enough lasers on the planet Earth to produce an image like this. Let me say that again. Today, in 2020, we do not have the technology to make an image like this. Here's something else that's really cool about this image. The slight shading has led people to say, let's analyze this thing on a computer. And take a look at this image here. You can see that the computer has processed the image to make the parts that are darkest stick out and the parts that are lightest recede back. And using that, they've actually been able to generate a three-dimensional image from the cloth. Now, let me just remind you, you're looking at an image right now, right? It's coming to you on the screen, and it's sort of 3D because it follows perspective. When I get close to the camera, my hands get bigger, right? When I get further away, I get smaller, right? So you can tell that I'm operating in a 3D space, but your image is flat, right? When you look at the screen, there's no depth to the image. It's all smushed like this, right? You don't feel like you could stick your hand in to this image. You can tell that it's flat. Well, all photographs, including the photography being used by my camera, would produce a flat image. The Shroud is producing an image that can generate 3D information on a computer. You can't do it with a normal photo. It can't be done. This image can, because if the skin itself or the body itself was somehow radiating light in all directions, it would leave a three-dimensional holographic image that you could put into a computer and process to get a 3D image. Now, an artist has used this digital 3D information to actually try and recreate what Jesus might have actually looked like. Because with the 3D information, we can get a whole lot more than just the two-dimensional face, right? We can get, like, what would the nose look like from different angles? How deep were the cheekbones, right? And using that information, trying to figure out, like, accounting for the fact that the guy was beaten and hurt when he was laid to rest. What did Jesus' face look like? And here is one of many images created by this artist. His name is Ray Downing. And I just think it is so cool. I mean, it can't be exact. Maybe it's not exactly what Christ looked like, but it's the closest thing that we could ever possibly produce to a photograph of Jesus, because it's based directly on the 3D information from the Shroud. So I really like to look at his artwork, and he puts Jesus actually in a lot of different scenes using this software that he has, and it's really interesting. It's cool to kind of be able to now picture maybe kind of what Jesus looked like. Okay, so blood, all the signs of crucifixion, and this weird miraculous light thing that doesn't seem to fit with the Middle Ages at all. All of this stuff seems to be pointing to the idea that this shroud is authentic. So why is there so much controversy around it? Why don't people assume that it is Jesus? And does it even maybe suggest that Jesus rose from the dead? And if it does suggest that, why aren't people taking Christianity way more seriously, or at least like looking into this? Like, why is it? What's the deal?